Now in this lecture, let's talk about the SNS plus SQS fan out pattern. So the idea is that you want a message to be sent to multiple SQS queries, but if you send them individually to every SQS query, there can be problems associated with it. For example, if your application crashes in between, and if they are delivery failures, or if you add more SQS queries down the road, therefore we want to use the fan out pattern. The idea is that you are going to push once in SNS topic, and then you are going to subscribe as many SQS queries as you want to that SNS topic. So these queries are subscribers, okay, and they will all receive the messages sent into SNS. So for example, we have a buying service that wants to send messages into two SQS queries. What it will do instead, it will send one message into an SNS topic, and the queries are subscribed. Queries are the subscribers of that SNS topic, so that the fraud service and uh, and the shipping service can read all the messages from their own SQS queries. The idea with this as well is that it's a fully decoupled model, and there is no data loss. SQS will give you data persistence, delayed processing, as well as reties of work. And with this pattern, you can add more SQS queries as a subscriber of the SNS topic over time. For this, we need to make sure that you SQS query access policy, as we have seen from before, allow your SNS topic to write to your SNS to your SQS query. So again, yet another use case for using SQS access policies, SQS query access policies. So next, how do we use this pattern for other purposes? For example, S3 events into multiple queries. So S3 events in multiple queries. So there is a limitation of S3 event rules, is that for a combination of event type, for example, an object is being created and a prefix, for example, images forward slash, you can only have one S3 events rule. But what if you want to send the same S3 event notification to multiple SQS queries? In that case, you would use the fan out pattern. So for example, we have S3 object created as an event appearing in S3 bucket, and will send this event into an SNS topic, and we will subscribe many SQS queries into that SNS topic as a fan out pattern. But but we could also subscribe other type of application, email, Lambda functions, etc, etc. And then what we get from this is that the message of the events happening in Amazon S3 is going to go to the many different destinations, and thanks to this fan out pattern here. So another architecture is that you can send data directly from SNS to Amazon S3. So Amazon S3 through Kinesis Data Firehose. So because SNS has a direct integration with KDF, Kinesis Data Firehose, then your buying service can send data into an SNS topic. Then Kinesis Data Firehose will receive that information, and then from Kinesis Data Firehose, you can send it to your Amazon S3 bucket, or for that matter, any supported Kinesis Data Firehose a specific destination, which allow you to be really extensible, is the way you want to maybe persist your messages from your SNS topic. So we can apply the final pattern to FIFO topics as well. So Amazon SNS has a FIFO or FIFO capability, which is first in first out, which gives ordering messages in the topic. So the producer send the messages 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the subscriber can only be in an SQS FIFO queue for now, which is receiving the messages 1, 2, then 3, then 4 in order. So the idea is that with the SNS FIFO, we get the same feature as SQS FIFO. We get ordering messages group ID, we get deduplication using a deduplication ID or content based deduplication, and we can have SQS FIFO queue as subscribers of the FIFO SNS topic. And in terms of throughputs, you are limited, you get the same throughputs as the SQS FIFO queue. because right now only the SQS FIFO queries can read from the SNS FIFO topics. So why do we need this? Why do we need this SNS FIFO plus SQS FIFO, the fan out pattern of something like this? Well, in case you want to do a fan out using SQS FIFO, so you need fan out, okay, ordering and deduplication. So the bank service, will send the data into an SNS FIFO topic. Buying service would send the data into an SNS FIFO topic, and then it will fan out to SQS FIFO, which can have the fraud service and the shipping service read from the FIFO queries as well. One last feature of SNS that can be really handy regarding the fan out pattern is that you can do messages filtering in SNS. So what is message filtering? Well, it's JSON policy that is used to filter messages sent to the SNS topics at subscription. So if a subscription doesn't have a filter policy, it will receive every message, and that's the default behavior. But let's take an example of what happens when we set up a message filtering policy, and so we have a buying service and it sends a transaction into an SNS topic. For example, the transaction here look like there's an order number, there's a product, for example the pencil, the quantity, and the states which is placed, and now we want to rate an SQS query just for the placed orders, not for all the orders, but just for placed orders. So for this we will subscribe the SQS query into the SNS topic, and we'll apply a filter policy in JSON, and we will specify in a policy that we want to have a state equals placed, and so only the message is matching the policy will go into the SQS query. But when we can have an SQS query for cancelled orders, and so we can create our own filter policy for cancelled orders, and they have those coming from the SNS topic into the SQS query, and so the placed order and the cancelled order in SQS query will not have the same message. We can also use the same filter policy, the cancelled one, to create an email subscription for cancelled orders. We could have a filter policy for declined orders, for example, and as another SQS query, or we can create an SQS query without a filter policy to have all the messages from that SNS topic. So using all these fan out patterns and message filtering FIFO queries and FIFO topics, we get lots of different possibilities, and the exam will try to test you on all of these. So here this is all about the FIFO fan out pattern with the SNS FIFO and SQS FIFO, and that's it for this lecture, and I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next one.